Hey, good afternoon. After my vacation, I'm back, and this week we are here with Dr. Peter Chrystal. So, thank you for staying with us this afternoon. As we are talking, I'm so happy that finally the summer starts here in Canada, and it's really warm and nice temperature out here. So thank you so much, Peter. How are you this afternoon? There is not afternoon, right?
That's right. Good morning, everyone. Where I am, of course, it's middle of winter. We had a big frost this morning, and it's sitting at just on 0 degrees, so fairly cold for Auckland. But welcome to everybody, and yeah, we leave it in the capable hands of Elizabeth to lead us in the discussions. And if there's any questions, type them online, and we look forward to a good session.
Exactly. Thank you so much for your time and to talk about amino acid. In my perspective, you are the most practical specialist in amino acid, and this is what you want to cover a little bit in this afternoon. We want to discuss first start to your experience when you start to think about amino acid and maybe a little bit of history as well, because at the past we start with crude protein, then we start with some amino acid. Most part of the world people use some of them, but I want to hear from you your experience.
I probably should give a little bit of a background to where I come from and what I do to everybody out there. So essentially, at the moment, I work for a company called Bioada in Australia. They are Australia's biggest poultry producer. And the other poultry producer that's big in that part of the world would be Ingham's, but they have a presence in New Zealand as well as Australia. But I've worked for Rainbow Chickens in South Africa many years ago, and then I spent a number of years working for Teagle Chickens here in Auckland, New Zealand. So I've sort of worked for three of the biggest integrators in three countries over the years. So maybe they get tired of me and move me on or whatever, but it's been as a practical commercial nutritionist. And as you rightly say, when we first started off, a lot of people were working on crude protein, total amino acid nutrition. And we moved on from there. In fact, early in the 1980s, I was very lucky to be involved with Professor Rob Khoos at Natal University. And he was working on digestible amino acids back in the 80s. So we've been using digestible. I've never used anything other than digestible in my career over 30 years. And as we've advanced, so we've gone into ideal amino acid ratios, and those have become much, much more important. But as we've gone now into the modern era, with high density broiler diets, with good broiler performance, we've started reducing crude protein and seen some added benefits by doing that. But when you do that, you need to then start adding other amino acids. And at this stage of the game, that's what we do. We tend to be running supplementary amino acids, lysine, methionine, threonine, isoleucine, and valine are typically coming into broiler diets at this stage. And on occasion, we'd strategically use something like tryptophan in poultry diets. So really interesting. Arginine is our next limiting, and this is in wheat-based diets. And we right down to those sort of levels of supplementary amino acids.
Yes, Peter, most parts of amino acids, when you think about to start, it's about productions like feeding, but we also have another advantage with the supplementation of amino acids, right? Especially lately, people are talking about the use of amino acids as a modulation of gut and microbiota. Do you believe in it? Or do you have an experience or your comments about that?
We certainly think it has an effect. It has an effect at the gut level. It has an effect on digestive dynamics. Now, maybe I should just touch a little on that, because that's some of the work we've been doing at Sydney University. Obviously, if you throw a whole lot of amino acids into a diet, these get absorbed into the bloodstream very quickly. In pigs in particular, you have a real problem because the animal can't store those very effectively. And by the time the bound protein is digested, you have this imbalance at the sites where protein deposition takes place. That's less so in birds, and we think that's because you get antiperistaltic movement in the bird gut. And so you have the movement of digester up and down. And birds seem to be able to store these amino acids a little bit better. So they're a bit better. But even so, you still have this rapid absorption of amino acids early on in the digestive tract. And you have competition between those, we believe, and glucose for absorption across the enterocytes into the blood. And we think that there's some opportunities there to modulate the amino acids and or the glucose and starch component of feed, but it has a big impact on the gut microflora. There's no question about that. And if you go too far with too many amino acids that are unbound, that are in the feed, I believe we have certain issues with the utilization of those amino acids, and we start seeing spiking threonine and other things in terms of the blood plasma. So yes, it has a big impact, and it can have a big negative impact if you get it wrong.
Well, about the practical point of view, and I know that you're very, very experienced in that. What is the care that we need to have when we start to add more amino acids, like methionine and lysine? The people already using by long time, but now you start to say that we can add another amino acids, and they start to enter in the composition of diet. What care we need to have in the practical way for the nutritionist that is listening to us now?
It's a very broad question, but it's a good one. It's what we've done, and maybe I'll step back just a little bit into 6 trials that we've run over the last 3 years at Sydney University, specifically looking at protein and amino acid nutrition. And we find that we can reduce our crude protein, by comfortably between 20 and 30 grams per kilogram. So that's between 2 and 3%. And if you do that, it will automatically start taking in your next synthetic amino acids, if you want to call them that, or unbound amino acids, which would be isoleucine and valine. But of course, it adds costs when you do that. So at the moment, it's still costing us a little bit of money. But out of 5 of those 6 trials, we've actually had an improvement in bird performance when we reduce crude protein. So the only advice I would give to those that are listening in is don't go too far. We would like to push it. On a maize-based diet, we've gone as low as from 22% all the way down to 16.5% protein and kept the performance there, but we can't do that in wheat. But of course, if you do that, it gets very, very expensive. So when you pull it back, the kind of things to watch out for, I don't think it matters how much lysine you put in. We can go to 5, even 7 kilos on a ton of lysine, and we don't seem to see any issues. The birds can handle it. Isoleucine valine coming in at about 350 to 1 kilo per ton, 350 grams. And then you need to keep an eye on things like glycine equivalents. That's really, really important. I think phenylalanine plus tyrosine sitting around in the background. Keep an eye on those. So in other words, I'm just saying some of the non-essential amino acids, if you want to call them that, become conditionally essential. And as long as you keep those where they should be, you'll find that performance doesn't suffer. But if you start pushing that protein too low and you don't look after your amino acids, you're going to run into trouble.
Okay, and when you talk about the balance between amino acids, not just to take out the crude protein, but you need to have a balance between them. What is the most common mistake that people can do when they start to do this amino acids? Like, what is the mistake that is very common when they choose to start to play with different amino acids in the formulation?
Again, that's an excellent question, and I think the most common mistake that I've seen around the world, and I still see it, is that people will use the breed. Let's say they use the breed recommendations. So take the AVIG and ROS 308 as an example. They put out new recommendations in 2019, and if you go and look at those recommendations, histidine, for example, is not on that list. Now, histidine is an essential amino acid, and the reason it's not on the list is because it's unlikely to be first limiting. But the minute you start reducing your protein and start using extra amino acids, the kind of mistakes people make is if they leave those out of the equation. You've got to make sure that all of the essential amino acids are there and they're all set at the minimum, so that if you are wanting to pull your protein down, that you don't run into deficiency of other essential amino acids, and then also keep an eye on the ones that might become conditionally essential. But it's the essential ones that's the biggest mistake. Arginine is usually there, but histidine is the next one, and it isn't there. So just keep an eye on that.
So estrogen is the one that they need to look at. And
once you don't look for, at the end of the day, it's when you look at a diet, and typically what I do when I look at a diet, I don't look so much at what's in the diet. I try and look for what's not in the diet, what's missing, and that's generally a good way of doing it. So what am I looking at? I did some work in India many years ago, and I had a look at the diet. They're getting terrible performance, and they were deficient in sodium. So something as simple as that, but it stood out because I was looking for something unusual, and I was doing some diets the other day, and it was drawing a lot of arginine, and they didn't look right. And they didn't look right, and I kept on working through them, and I'd had the wrong figure in for one of my matrix values for arginine in soybean meal. And so you've got to look at the diet. Does it look right? If it doesn't look right, why doesn't it look right? And then delve into it. It's easier when you've got 30 years experience of looking at diets, I suppose, but it is important to look at what's not there.
And another questions that I have is about we talk about to have this amino acid in diet and the impact in the environment. This is true. You have seen better impact. You have some numbers to show that we can really have a better an improvement in the productions, but as well less impact in the environment with amino acid.
Yeah, look, for every percentage drop in protein, you have a significant drop in the nitrogen excretion, and that's measurable and it's been repeatable. I don't know who is on the webinar in terms of where people are from, but I can certainly tell you that in some parts of the world there are issues. In Europe, there are obviously issues with nitrogen excretion and phosphorus, really, really important. But in Australia, the more nitrogen we can pump out of the back end of the bird, probably at this stage, the better, because we use it as fertilizer. So there are some places have a problem, some places don't. Australia doesn't, but we rely on soybean meal that's imported from the Americas, and that is something we want to reduce. So that drives us more than environment. But one of the added benefits of pulling protein back a little is you have a much lower level of water to feed intake ratio. Now, that might not sound important, but Kim Huang Dr. Huang, when he was with Avigen, they did some really, really good work on energy and protein. And they actually presented this in 2011, if memory serves me right, at that Australian Poultry Science Symposium, and showed very clearly that reducing protein reduces water to feed intake ratio. So you get much, much drier litter. And if you get drier litter, you get less pad burn, less breast blisters. And for us, that has been quite a dramatic improvement by pulling protein back, and well worthwhile.
And when you have a different quality of ingredients in your experience, like by different poor quality of ingredients, this has changed the way you do the formulations for amino acids, or do you have any tips for share with the nutritionists that are listening to us?
Again, I have just recorded my presentation for the PSA, and really awkward to do when you don't have an audience. But in terms of the actual way I look at raw materials, is we use a Vonic system, so we use the Amino NR through a Vonic. But there's a number of others. Adissio have one, Novus have one, and generally they're pretty good, and as long as you're consistent. So everything's based on amino acid analysis through NR, and we find it's fairly accurate, and then formulated to digestible. What I then do in my particular case is I use my own regression equation. So every raw material I do, I build up regressions, and in that regression, I take into account the variability by using the standard error of the mean. Now, not everybody does it that way, but if you've got poor quality materials, they're going to be more variable. You can set up a dummy nutrient in your formulation system called CV, so coefficient of variation. And I have, for every raw material, a running CV. So I know how much they vary by, and usually on protein. It's translatable into the amino acids, but protein is the easy one to do. And then if I want a feed that's less variable, so let's say my starter feed, I can set a restraint or restriction on the variability. And what that does is it tends to then start pushing out raw materials that are very variable. And now I'll rather use the variable ones in the withdrawal feed, or in birds where it doesn't matter, or in layers where in fact you have less of an issue. So that's what I do, and that accounts for it. But there's no easy answer to that. It all depends on how much of a risk you want to take and how much you're willing to accept variation in your finished product as well. And birds are quite good. They'll eat more or less of certain feeds depending on the levels of nutrients in those feeds. So they do adjust a bit. And of course, the first thing that happens is feed conversion goes out. And when that happens, the nutritionist is always in trouble. So,
Peter, we received some questions from the audience here, and they are asking for, in your experience, what the minimal rations arginine lysine should be used in grower finisher diets as we reduce the CP levels?
yeah, that's again a very, very good question. I tend to run my ratio at 104, so 1.04 to lysine. But I've actually had another look at that, and in my grow, I've actually lifted it a little up to 1.07. Some of the data would suggest to go to 1.1. I think that's too high from a cost point of view. But I'm running at 1.07 now, particularly in the regions where I'm using Amino as an arginine source, just because arginine is either not available or very expensive. And for want of a better value, I'm using 70% arginine contribution from the guanidinoacetic acid, or Amino.
Okay, and another question that we have here, what digestibility coefficient do you prefer? From sectomized roosters or ideal digestibility SI in chickens or adult birds?
Again, that's an excellent question. I guess the answer to that one is be consistent. None of those digestibilities are perfect. Once you synthesize a bird, you alter the flora, the microflora of the gut substantially, so that has an impact. If you take standardized ileal digestibility values, which is what I use, those are also flawed and not perfect. One of the other things we've shown is that, in fact, most of your digestion on highly digestible raw materials takes place within the jejunum. So at the end of the day, jejunum, in fact, you have possibly a better indicator, but of course nobody uses those. So I don't think one system is necessarily better than another. Just stick to whichever system you use and be consistent. I currently would use the digestibility coefficients from Evonik as a standard, but even those are variable. And unfortunately, Rick Klein is not on the webinar today, but he would say, as he said to me the other night, they're wrong. So I guess it doesn't matter what you use. If you use the Brazilian ones, if you use the CVP tables, whatever you use, try to be consistent. Be careful with the old CVP on something like corn. It's got a very low digestibility. But as I say, again, just be consistent. It's not really answering the question, I know. It's a roundabout way of doing it. And as I say, I'm using LEMI, but it's SIDs or standardized ileal digestibility values.
I see that they are very curious about your experience. There is someone here asking about what formulation software do you use?
Oh, I have a lot of opinions about formulation software. I'm a user of Format NC and have been since it was a DOS program. So I've continued to use Format. It's got its own issues in terms of comparing data across feed mills. But I can make Format do anything through macros and scripts and so on. I like the French one, Alex 3. I think that looks really, really good to me. Brill is very, very good. Concept 5 is commonly used in Australia because it's cheap. So it depends on what you want to spend on a package. Indigo is a new one from Format. I don't particularly like that one. I'm not very keen on the ones that are linked into SQL. I find them slow and clunky. Format is rapid, very, very quick. I can do all my feed mills in a few seconds, and I like it. But it's not without its problems, and the computer people don't like it. The computer people like SQL. So the one I don't like, that I've struggled with, has been Best Mix in the past. But again, each to their own. Certainly, if I was moving to an SQL package today, I'd probably go with Alex 3. But I've got no particular allegiance to any particular software company. And if you want a small, single-shot, easy, cheap one, Rick Klein's SpecFeed Express is fantastic. He's written one that's cheap, and it puts your printout into a spreadsheet, and that spreadsheet is active. So if you change the price of your maize or your corn in that spreadsheet, it's interactive and it'll change the pricing of that feed. So, but that's a single shot, least cost, single mix type package. But my wife, who's a nutrition consultant, uses that all the time.
So, and you talk about cost. When you compare the diet with the formulation of amino acids that you like, how is the cost of this diet? And maybe I can ask also, what is the cost for you? The cost is the cost of the diet, or is the performance of the animal?
No, the cost of the software. So Format has got, since Cargill has taken it over, it's got very expensive compared to when Merrill owned the company. So the software can get very expensive. The diet should be identical. If your software is working properly and your rounding factors and so on are the same, you should have exactly the same answer. And they all give the same answer. The algorithm that sits behind them is all the same. There is some non-linear feed formulation available at the moment. That's got its own set of issues because when you formulate with non-linear, you don't get shadow pricing. And it's useful academically to find out what levels of phytase, for example, you should be using. But once you've established that, then you can run with a normal least cost formulation.
But what is the cost of formulation for you? When you analyze a diet, what you take into account is your diet as the cost of it as ingredient that you use it, or you make a relationship in the performance?
Oh, no, I use a broiler model. So I'm a big user of the EFG broiler model. And that broiler model is driven by margin over feed costs, so profit. And every single region in the world will differ. If you're growing chickens in New Zealand today, you will find that they perform extremely well because there's no disease and you can afford to basically feed them a high spec diet. So to me, it's all about profit. Your chicken is there as the means to converting inputs into profit. It just happens to be a chicken in the middle that we use, but it doesn't have to be. So each individual operation will have a different set of parameters driving their business and different targets, what we call a objective function. So in modeling, and I use this all the time, I hound our salespeople to give me average prices for revenue for things like chicken breast, drumsticks, whole birds, what the proportion is that we supply into the market. And it's not perfect, but I get this every quarter and I build that into the model. And I get the model to drive my feed specifications on maximum profit. And that's how I've done it for probably 20 years and continue to do that today. So this idea that AVGen or Cobb or Hubbard put out a particular set of specifications as their breed standards, that's fine as a guideline, but don't hang your hat on that. Your bird will respond, and our bird responds. We get better than the breed standard performance out in the field, but my specs are high. So your specification of your feed needs to be set at the optimum for your business, and that's not easy to do. And most nutritionists will tell you it's very difficult to do. Others will say it's impossible to do.
I imagine it. There is another questions here. There is people looking at. I see my friend Sandra Rodriguez is online. Thank you to Sandra. And here another questions from Parsa. He say he thank you for the webinar, and I thank you for staying with us. And for you, Peter, he asked you if he read in some articles that low crude protein supplemented with amino acids cause leg problems and increase the cooling. Do you have an experience in that?
I have never seen any issues with leg problems and reduced crude protein diets. However, there's a proviso here. I think what you need to do when you reduce crude protein in feed is you need to have a very close look at your phytate phosphorus in the diets, because quite often that will drop quite low. And if you have a phytase in the diet and you overestimate the value of your phytase, in other words, and I've had this debate with enzyme suppliers, that when you reduce crude protein and you give your phytase a full amino acid and phosphorus spec, you could actually land up overestimating its value. Now we're about to do another trial with phytase, And that's the only time I would think you'd get an issue. A lot of the trials that we've run are without enzymes because we don't want the confounding effect of phytase, but practically you might be looking at phytase. But I've not seen a single leg problem or anything that stood out as being a leg issue with reduced crude protein diets in any of our experiments, but do make sure your calcium and phosphorus is where it should be.
Peter, you talk about enzyme. How do you work with the different kind of enzymes and the amino acids? How is some practical tips we can look at?
Well, this is getting into very dangerous territory because our view, we all know phytase works. There's no question about that. And you've got to decide on whether you want to go at a normal level or what you want to call a super dosing level with phytase, and whether you want to give it a full matrix value or 80% of the matrix value.
What do you prefer? You prefer this double enzyme, double level? How do you feel about this?
I would go double. I would go double minimum. Double phytase minimum would be sort of the standard I would run at. When you're feeding a wheat-based diet, you would put a xylanase in as standard or a beta glucanase with barley, and I tend to only adjust the energy of the grain itself with a xylanase. So I don't give the xylanase a matrix value. I add it, so I have a wheat with either with enzyme or wheat without enzyme. Then when you start adding the third enzyme, a protease or a mannanase or any other NSPase, then it gets tricky to try and put a value to those, because of course they can't always be additive. You can't just keep getting better and better and more contributions. You're going to run out of steam at some stage. So I'm feeling is the first enzyme gives you a lot of bang for your buck. The second enzyme less so. The third enzyme you've got to question very carefully. I'm not saying don't put it in, but make sure you don't overestimate its value. And anything more than that, I'm not sure whether you'd get any benefit with the fourth enzyme. Again, it depends on what you're feeding. If you were feeding a lot of guar gum, then you might well be using a mannanase in there. And a protease has been shown to improve digestibility of amino acids. In some cases, that's great. In other cases, does it translate into better performance? And that you need to evaluate as a return on your investment. So I look for a return on my investment of 3-to-1. And unless I see a 3-to-1, I'd rather bank the money, because spending that money up front in a big company is hard to justify if you don't have a really good return on your investment.
Interesting. Another question here is they ask it, if it's possible to reduce metabolism energy as crude protein is reduced, and any energy sparring effect, is there a future for net energy? Three questions.
Okay, the first one, is there a chance to reduce energy, metabolizable energy, when you reduce crude protein?
Yes.
In our experience, no, that doesn't work. We've tried that. We get a little bit of a leaner bird if we do it, but we lose performance. So there's something to do with energy metabolism when you reduce crude protein in diets, and we don't have a really good handle on that yet. But no, I don't have a fixed ratio of protein to energy. A lot of people do. I run them independently of each other. And again, I use the broiler model, EFG model, to do that and determine what's optimum for our business. Energy is a difficult one. I heard the question, is there a future for net energy? On paper, net energy sounds very good. I've been running net energy in the background of my feed formulations ever since Bob Swick from UNE came up with these equations. And I can tell you that there's no difference between net energy really and ME in terms of bird performance. ME is as good as net energy. And unfortunately, net energy is calculated from ME anyway. So if you have problem with your ME value, you're going to just be moving that into NE. So I don't personally think there's a future in net energy, not in poultry. Two reasons for that. Firstly, I don't see much of a change if I use net energy as opposed to metabolizable energy. And I think the proportion of loss in poultry, particularly in broilers, in terms of the difference between metabolizable and net energy, that loss is very much more variable than in pigs. So I think it's just a moving target that we're really going to struggle to get anywhere near. And look, we just don't, a lot of the data we just don't have for net energy. We don't have figures for it. I don't know, you said there was a third one there.
Peter, we are just running in time here. It's always very few time to know all, to take all your information and what we can learn from you. But I know that you have worked hard in a book that we're gonna launch soon about amino acids. I think I was Kenny that is helping us to project the cover of the book for us. And can you talk about this book, how this idea happens, and how can the guys find this book in the future when you launch it?
Yes, this book is Rick Klein. Many of you might know Rick. Rick Klein and myself, we were at university together in the early 80s, 1980s, long before Elizabeth's time, of course, in the industry. And you might be aware that he's written a poultry nutrition book some time ago. And 3 years ago, he said to me, "Look, I'd like to update my broiler nutrition book. Would you like to write a book with me?" So this has been a bit of a labor of love, and it's taken us 3 years to write an update on broiler nutrition. A lot of it is based on Steve Leeson's original work, so it's sort of moves on from there. Steve Leeson and Summers commercial poultry nutrition or commercial broiler nutrition. And so we've used Steve. In fact, Steve did one of the reviews in the book on the energy chapter. But we've written that over 3 years. There's a lot more emphasis on things like gut health. Enzyme chapter is in there, which obviously is far more advanced than it would have been in those old books. So that's already at the printers, at Context Publications, and hopefully it'll be available on the market. I know Jeffo has kindly ordered a whole lot that we'll have their logo on the book for, and so thank you very much, Jeffo, for that. I have no idea how it works in terms of royalties and so on, but I do know that Rick has said that you never ever earn anything out of it, but the publication people do. So hopefully it'll be a success for them. And in memory of Wes Ewing, who passed away not that long ago, as he was MD of Context, and we will miss him. I've known him since Pravimi days. And anyway, we're launching the book. It should come out this year. It's at the printers, ready to be pre-ordered, and we hope that everybody enjoys it and doesn't just put it on the shelf, but actually uses it as a reference book for broilers. And then this coming year, 2021, we'll write another one. We're going to start on a layer book that'll include broiler breeders and commercial layers into a nutrition book.
Very good, very good. So as we are finalized here, I would like to ask you, Peter, what's the final message that you gonna let for these guys that are follow up us? What you would like to leave as a message as a nutritionist for the future of the nutrition, animal nutrition, and especially poultry nutrition, in your point of view?
We probably need another hour to do that, but I think from my side, be consistent in what you do. make sure you have technical. We have a very good technical arrangement with Evonik. Set up these sort of things. Use that sort of information that's out there. And to me, use something like a broiler model. The EFG model, it's not without its problems, but it's a fantastic tool. And if, as a nutritionist, you learn one thing from it, it's all about profitability. It's about getting the maximum gain over the price of your feed, and then work closely with your suppliers, work with your GFOs, have these arrangements where you have these relationships. They're important. They're important. Don't just be a price chaser and chase the cheapest thing on the market, because at the end of the day, when there's trouble out there and there's a lack of supply, you could land up not getting what you need to. And really working with others, I'm terrible. I'm not an island. I like to gather information from everybody else, and I cherry pick what I think is important and build that into my formulations. And it's worked for me up to now. And anybody ever needs any sort of help on the EFG broiler model and how to set it up, by all means, drop me an email, and I'll try and help you where I can.
Okay. Thank you so much, Peter. I would like to stay longer here and you have more questions, but yeah, you can let the questions there and later on we can address to Peter if he has time to answer you. And we also let the broiler nutrition book cover in the session. So if you want to go there, and there is also the content that the book has, and then you can have a preview idea how this book looks like. So thank you so much, Peter, for your time. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. It's always a learning.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. And great talking to all of you. And all of you have a good day or a good evening, as the case might be. And hopefully we'll catch up in the future.
Yes, yes. The poultry science is arriving, and Peter will be there, right? So we'll be,
yes,
we'll be in this. So next week we will come back again with a new webinar, talk about microbiota, and maybe we'll address some amino acids and microbiota as well. So thank you so much, Peter. Thank you so much for you that stay virtually with us, and we see each other next week. Bye-bye. Thank you.